I never intended to be an undercover cop. My plan was to work enough time as a beat cop to make detective, and then work my way into financial crimes or something equally cushy. Do the full 25, make it out with a pension, and then hey, presto, I can play golf for the rest of my days. But life, as they say, had other plans for little old me. I was still in uniform when the city had a string of overdoses among high school kids in the early 2000s. Kids were dropping like flies and the department was getting crushed in the press, so Brass needed someone who could blend into the streets without looking like a cop, and they needed them quick. Now, I was still young, kind of skinny looking, and having grown up on the streets, I knew how to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And not only did the job come with automatic promotion to detective, but the bonus pay they were offering was better than anything financials were about to offer me. I was also really sick of working uniform, clocking in and out like a regular Joe, and getting disrespected on the daily by just about everybody. And so, after weighing it up, I thought, screw it, and took the job. I worked Friday as usual, then come Monday morning, my lieutenant pulled me into his office and said that he was sad to see me go. He knew where I was headed, so he wished me luck and told me to be careful. And then up I went to the 3rd floor where my history as a police officer was officially expunged from the record. There was no big fanfare or anything, no pep talk or welcoming ceremony. They gave me a pager, a beat-up Civic with hidden compartments, and about 3 weeks of crash course training on how not to die. I grew my hair and beard out as they taught me how to build a legend, as they called it, and now I had to remember every single lie I ever told because the streets have a long memory and a short fuse for liars and cheats. And then once I was ready, they dropped me in at the deep end. I became Mickey, a junkie from upstate who moved to the city for a regular fix. I spent the first couple of weeks scoping out all the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, learning who the players were, brushing up on the more contemporary street talk, and making sure no one recognized me as a cop. I obviously wasn't working the same neighborhoods as my days as a beat cop, but it's a small world, and I didn't want to get too close until I was sure that no one would clock me. But then once I'd established a presence, mostly by walking around pretending I was boosting and scoring, I was able to start making some moves. I was looking to get in with the local dealers, right? To figure out who was pushing bad dope onto good kids and causing this spat of overdoses. Now, I needed an angle, and together the team behind the scenes, this is what we came up with. I'd tell one of the corner guys that I had a solid connection for his boss, one that'd land them high-quality product at rock-bottom prices. And then when they inevitably showed interest, I'd tell them my Marine Corps brother was in charge of the mail over there in Kandahar, and he was shipping kilos upon kilos of Afghan heroin back to me in all these specifically marked packages that didn't get scanned. I was Mickey No Needles, with my legend being that I wasn't a total scumbag, so when I met with an underboss and made my proposal, he told me to come back with a sample. And then when that sample was satisfactory, I made a second proposal. I could get them a steady stream of that cheap Afghan dope, but I wanted into the organization so I could learn the tricks of the trade. When the dope ran out, they were free to kick me to the curb if I wasn't pulling my weight and my money wasn't right. And with that, they agreed. I spent the next 6 months deeply embedded in one of the state's biggest dope-dealing networks, slowly earning more and more of their trust until I was able to start passing on information that would lead to arrests, without making my new friends suspicious. Things went tremendously well in that time, and I learned a hell of a lot during that time as well. But probably the most important thing that I'd learned during that first stint that I spent undercover was not to fly too close to the sun. Not too soon, anyway. Because even when you think you've got a crew cracked and eating out of your palms, it only takes a touch of paranoia to put the entire operation in jeopardy. And in this case, it was a stroke of bad luck. The same day my info led to the arrest of one of the group's cash couriers, one of their stash houses was raided by the DEA. The raid was completely unconnected to my own department's UC ops, as the agents had been working on their own intel. But to my new friends, it looked an awful lot like a concerted effort, and that the info had come from an informant in their organization. Well, they were right. The leaks were coming from me, just nothing which led to the raid on that house. But obviously that didn't matter to us or them, and the reality was that my days undercover were numbered. The backroom team didn't just pull me out, not even with the increased danger, because even with them being wise to my general presence, the presence of an informant or undercover meant the organization would be under pressure. And if they were under pressure, they'd make more mistakes, which in turn would lead to more arrests. They only wanted to pull me out once a kind of tipping point had been reached, when the threat to me outweighed the good all that paranoia was doing, and for a while, that tactic worked exactly as planned. And then one day, I got the call that pretty much ended my stint undercover. About the same time my character Mickey No Needles started to make serious money, the department rented an apartment for me. It was a crappy apartment in a crappy building, but that lined up with my character not giving a damn because he'd been homeless. To him, even a crummy apartment felt like a palace, and I didn't care if the plumbing was a little shoddy. Now anyways, one day a guy that I worked with called Pete had buzzed my apartment with 2 of his boys. This was a pretty regular occurrence, so it didn't raise any alarm bells, but then once we were sat down, Pete told me the good news. His bosses had found the rat. Moments like that either make or break you as an undercover, and I know guys who have talked their way out of trouble whose performances would have won an Oscar had they been put to film. And so instead of so much as flinching, I kind of sighed with relief and said, "Finally," and then asked Pete who it was. But when he said the rat turned out to be some nobody who worked at a corner store somebody was slinging dope outside of, I didn't need to hide my surprise. No one was stupid enough to talk to the cops about the crew I'd infiltrated, especially not some Indian kid who worked a corner store for his uncle. They had a bad reputation and based themselves in a real see-nothing, know-nothing kind of neighborhood, so right away the story didn't sound right to me. But Pete was insistent. In fact, the bosses had the kid tied to a chair in some basement downtown, beating the crap out of him while they got him to recount everything he told the cops. And they wanted everyone above street level there to see it. I just had to go with it, man. I knew that there was a chance that it might be a trap, and that it'd be me that had ended up tied to that chair, but coming out with some excuse as to why I wouldn't go would also look suspicious, so I had no choice. I carried a gun with me, so if things got sketchy, I could always try defending myself before they got the straps on me. But my character would want to see this guy that was out to put him in jail, and he wouldn't be squeamish about seeing him get hurt either. And so I just went with it, put on a jacket, and got into Pete's car. Nothing he did or said made me think that I was about to get whacked. And, ironic as it may seem, criminals tend not to be the best liars. Those that are end up becoming defense attorneys. Am I right or am I right? And so by the time we got where we were going, I was fairly convinced that I was in the clear. And I was. Because there, sitting in the middle of this grimy old cabin, is some Indian kid. Could have been no older than 20, and he'd been beaten to a goddamn pulp. It was a tough thing to see, knowing that there was a good chance this kid was there for next to no reason. Maybe he said good morning to a cop and some extra paranoid dealer got it into his head that it was him who had been feeding them information. There was no way of knowing for sure. I never found out for certain if my new friend's hunch had been correct, but the fact remained, it should have been me in that chair, and just standing in that room with those guys felt like holding a loaded gun to my head. The bosses had figured that the rat was someone on the inside, but even if he wasn't, they still wanted all the underbosses and captains there to get a first-hand look at what happened to traitors. The things they did to that poor kid will haunt me for the rest of my life, and the hardest thing I ever had to do was act like I was enjoying it. At least until the kid's inside started showing on the outside. And then, and only then, could I let a little of what I was really feeling shine through. They tortured that poor kid to death. There was no quick execution, no bullet to the head or blade to the throat. They beat and burned and tasered that kid until his body gave out, and he didn't wake up again. He passed out a whole bunch during, but They were always able to bring him around again with a taser and some kind of smelling salt someone had with them. But then one time he passed out and he just didn't wake up again, and that was all she wrote for that kid. Only in the movies do people do the right thing in those situations. Only the hero stands up and says me when their skin is on the game. Because in real life, only a gun to my mother's head would have pushed me to stop what was happening and tell them that it should be me in that kid's place. Because while it might have been hard to watch him die, the easiest thing in the whole world was keeping my mother effing mouth shut. When they were done with the kid, the bosses gave some speech about how we should expect the same thing to help us if we ever talked to the cops. And if our dealers or corner boys did the same, we were expected to do the same thing to them and make sure no one stepped out of line who didn't have a death wish to begin with. And then after that, when all was said and done, they sent us out on our way again. Pete was so shocked and grossed out by what he saw that he declined my dinner invitation when we drove back into the city. I wasn't feeling particularly hungry myself, but that wasn't the point. It was to make it look like I was, when I knew damn well that I'd say no to everything except a strong drink and a cigarette. I acted as cool as possible given the circumstances, much more of a someone finally took out the trash attitude than that poor kid attitude. Because even the guys Pete brought with him had these looks on their faces saying, why didn't they just shoot the kid already? That was disgusting. Pete dropped me back at my place, saying that he had stuff to do, and then after lazily walking up my steps and giving him a wave to say thanks for the ride, I just about sprinted up the stairs to my second-floor apartment and called time on the whole operation. I was out in the field by the end of the day and debriefing with my backroom team about all the crap that I'd seen, heard, and done when I wasn't wearing a wire, all stuff that I could provide personal testimony for in a court of law. The operation was a huge success, and we managed to put away a grand total of 23 criminals on the back of the work that I'd done. And that felt good, but it didn't do anything for the guilt that I felt, because even though I'd helped put his killers behind bars, I still feel like I had that kid's blood on my hands, and no matter how much I try, I'll never be able to wash it off. In the small farming town of Skidmore, years of fear and resentment had settled like dust over the streets. Then, on a hot summer day in 1981, something happened in broad daylight that no one seemed willing to explain. When the silence that followed proved stronger than any testimony, the town's name became bound forever to a mystery whispered more than spoken. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. My name's Rowan, and I live here in the Netherlands with my wife and 2 young children. I have a nice life, and I'm grateful for it, and to look at me, you might never suspect that I went to prison for 8 years on charges of drug trafficking and brandishing a deadly weapon. But I did, and since enough time has passed that I don't mind telling the story anymore, I figured you and you viewers might like to hear it. Now, I never planned on being a trafficker. I didn't need it either. I only started after a friend named Hans talked me into it, and because it brought a little bit of excitement to my very meaningless existence. Hans, myself, and a friend of ours named Wim were all university graduates and had settled into the 9-to-5 routine for a few years already. And then one day, Hans's girlfriend called us with some bad news. He'd been into asset trading for quite some time, we just didn't know how deep he really was. And so when we found out that he'd lost almost €250,000 when the stock markets crashed, we were shocked. Hans fell into a deep depression and had to take some time off of work. Now, he wasn't himself for this whole period, and it was very sad to see, but then one day, he came back. And at first he said he was just feeling better and that the medication that he'd been taking had done its job, and he wanted to return to work. But I didn't believe it, and neither did Wim. It didn't seem like Hans was better so much as his symptoms had changed. He got very busy and became very secretive, so much that his wife thought that he was having an affair until he let her in on his little secret. I don't know how he talked her into it. Maybe all she was interested in was the money, but after a little more planning, Hans let me and Wim in on his secret too. He was going to make his money back by selling ecstasy tablets. We thought Hans had gone completely crazy, but he hadn't, and far from it, in fact. The thought of making all that money back dragged him back from the brink of sanity, and then since Wim was chronically unemployed, despite his qualifications, he didn't need much convincing either. It was me that needed the most convincing, but not only had Hans laid out what seemed to be a foolproof plan, but it all just seemed so incredibly exciting. Now, I might not have been struggling for money, but I was very much struggling with a lack of excitement in my life. I had a very demanding job, and fortunately one that paid very well, but exciting it was not. And being confined to this very gray and flavorless lifestyle, it sort of nurtured a kind of rebelliousness in me. At the time, I didn't recognize that rebelliousness for what it really was, a desire to self-destruct. But along with the sense of camaraderie between myself, Hans, and Wim, there was a real sense of all these bankers broke the rules, ruined lives, and got away with it. Why shouldn't we make a little money selling pills to the English? In comparison, selling ecstasy was infinitely more honest to me. And the work went like this. Me and Wim would take turns driving from Amsterdam to the Czech Republic. It was a 16-hour round trip, and there we would pick up shipments of raw MDMA organized by Hans before driving back into Holland for sorting and pressing. And then once we'd turned the powder into pills, we'd work with one of 2 fishing vessels and smuggling the packages into English waters, where it would be met by local distributors and packages would be exchanging hands. We kept things simple, discreet, and very profitable. Then, with Hans in our fishing boat doing all the hard work, all Wim and I had to do was go on a road trip every 2 weeks and bring back some nice Czech lager along with 10 kilos of product. 16 hours in a long drive, but we got to collect obscene amounts of cash for one day's work every 2 weeks, which, as you can imagine, we were very happy about. It was all so simple, at least until one day when things got complicated. Wim was meeting with the captain of the fishing boat that we were working with, and so the captain could hand over a shipment of cash from England. Now, they were followed by a group of Moroccans who were targeting drug dealers, beaten very badly and then relieved of almost 60,000 euros worth of British currency. It was a disaster for us, a huge setback. But not only had we all lost that money, we had to change all of our routines and find another fishing boat to work with, which was not easy. We also had to expand the organization somewhat and find somebody who was capable of preventing a similar recurrence. What we needed was a criminal security guard. And as you can imagine, this was also not easy to find, and Hans had to do a great deal of interviewing in order to find the right guy. He obviously had to be very discreet, but he wasn't simply there to fight off any robbers. He also needed to be intimidating enough that his presence would deter any robbery attempts. And it was by this logic that he decided on a man named Dennis. According to Hans, Dennis was an ex-con, well known in the criminal underworld and most importantly, a former weightlifting champion. But it was his reputation among Dutch criminals which drew Hans's attention. Because for some reason, anyone who ever crossed Dennis or worked against his interests ended up dead or in prison, making him an asset worth paying for, even if it did put a major dent in our profits. We managed to find another fishing boat crew to work with, captained by a man named Nils, and for the next 18 months or so, everything ran smoothly again, until we ran into 2 quite concerning problems. The first occurred when 2 little upstarts decided to try and rob us again. Now, he figured that they were connected to the Moroccan crew who robbed us the first time, but that second time, it did not go well for them. They used a fake pistol and a kitchen knife and tried to corner me as I came out of a public toilet at a service station. Dennis was standing some way away smoking a cigarette, and I think maybe the boy thought that he'd left and it was their time to strike. Well, it was not, and recognizing the gun to be a decommissioned replica, Dennis knocked out the knife wielder and began stomping on him. And he did it so much that I had to get him to stop, because while I too was angry at the threat to my life, murdering this boy would just bring way too much attention down upon us. However, since this was simply Dennis doing his job and ensuring the boy was in no position to come back at us for revenge, for a while at least, this was only my secondary concern. The first involved Niels, our new fishing captain. I was conducting a cash collection one day when Niels asked about getting out. He'd been involved with us for 18 months or so, like I said, and having made a sizable amount of money from it, he wanted to quit while he was ahead. He wanted to know how that would work, and since I had no idea, I told him I'd ask Hans and relay back to him what was said. It seemed like a very considerate thing to ask, as it'd give Hans time to find alternative forms of transportation. Hans had also been quite reasonable in the past, so I expected a reasonable response. But when I asked him, Hans was not pleased. He said if Niels wanted to quit, then he needed to leave Amsterdam, maybe even the country. Now, we already had a load of loose ends hanging around in terms of the 2 fishing boats we used to work with that quit after the attack, so if Niels wanted out of the job, he needed to make himself disappear. And this was obviously not the answer I was hoping for. We'd always been gentlemen thieves, if you will, but Hans was now talking like a gangster, saying Niels should shut up, keep taking his money, and stop making problems. When I told him Niels wasn't going to like this answer, he told me to make him like it, but not with violence or anything, but by raising his share. I agreed that might sweeten the deal, so to speak, but when I told Niels what Hans said, he was equally unimpressed. He accepted the pay raise, but no matter how much I tried to dress up what Hans said as a positive, "You're great at what you do, we need you," etc., Niels understood a threat when he heard one. He kept calm during the exchange. He didn't want to alert his crew that anything was wrong, but I remember how he almost simmered over when he asked me if he was trapped and if Hans was threatening his family or not. Now, I told him it wasn't like that, how Hans was just stressed, and how I'd even try and up his share even more if it smoothed over the misunderstanding, as I put it. I did my best, but my best wasn't good enough, and from then on, our relationship with Niels started to deteriorate. I did my best to shield Hans from it, and I suppose that shielded Niels too, but he became almost impossible to deal with at times. He kept asking for an increase in his share, which Hans wouldn't grant, and then whenever I had to give him the bad news, he'd stop answering our calls, sometimes when we needed him most too. It didn't hamper our operation, but it added a layer of stress that was clearly designed to force our hand and find a different boat captain. If we wouldn't let him go willingly, he was going to make us get rid of him. The only trouble was, he still had to be very good at his actual job in order to not get himself caught, meaning no matter how displeased he was, he always delivered and kept Hans happy. Now flash forward to just over a year after Niels said that he wanted out, and I honestly thought things had smoothed over. He was still very much cold with me, but he'd stopped complaining and being difficult and was very much more proactive in keeping up with dates and times, etc. Amazingly, Dennis was still with us too and had managed to keep himself out of prison despite being in a lot of law-breaking, and honestly, he refused to even park his car correctly sometimes. It was like every law he encountered was a direct challenge that he had to defy. He was a constant source of worry for us, and we were terrified that something he did would attract attention to us. But at the same time, he did his job fantastically and somehow kept trouble at bay. It was almost like a tornado. We were right there in the center of it. And things went on like that for some time until one day, when the storm finally hit. I remember Hans texting me one day asking if I wanted to go for coffee. I told him sure, but when he came back to pick me up, he drove me to an abandoned warehouse near the docks and walked me inside. I knew then that it must have been business-related and that the added discretion means that Hans was worried about something. But then, and out of nowhere, Hans pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. He kept asking, "Is it you? Is it you?" over and over. And what else could I say but, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. He told me to pull up my shirt, pull down my pants, take off my shoes, and give him my phone. And with the gun pointed at me, I did everything he said while shaking like a leaf. I realized very quickly that there was an informant somewhere, because what else would Hans be looking for? but it was only once he was happy it wasn't me that he confirmed it. He didn't know if it was an informant or a full-blown undercover cop, but someone inside our organization was talking to the police. It was, as you can imagine, a very surreal situation. There I was, pulling up my pants in a cold, dark warehouse on the edge of town, while one of my old university friends, turned gangster, was explaining how our lives as we know it might well be over. Now, he wouldn't say how he knew, just that he knew. But if we didn't get rid of the mole was going to get rid of us. It had been a no-wire operation, meaning the police hadn't risked their operative by strapping a microphone to him and were planning on getting a conviction based on the mole's testimony alone. The gears were in motion, and the hammer of justice was bearing down on us, but if we could take out the mole and stop all that testimony from reaching our courtroom, we might just skirt the charges if we weren't found with any product in our possession. And then since he wasn't the mole and I wasn't the mole, there were only 3 possibilities: Wim, Niels, or Dennis. Now it obviously wasn't Dennis. The prospect was almost comical to us. In fact, when Hans did have the temerity to ask if he was working with the police, Dennis said that if he asked him that question again, he'd kill him. Now he also suggested that we torture Wim so we could really be sure that he wasn't the informant, but I knew from the start that it couldn't have been him. The trafficking operation was the best thing to ever happen to him, and even having found a full-time job and a girlfriend, he'd never have given up and betrayed us. Now, Wim also acted very offended when Hans asked him the big question, but once we ticked him off the list, that left only one person who could have been feeding information to the police: Niels, our fishing boat captain. And at that moment, it all made perfect sense to us. No wonder Niels had stopped complaining and asking for raises. No wonder he seemed way more interested than usual in where the shipments were going and where we produced our product. He was talking to the police. It made sense that they couldn't put a concealed microphone on him either, because the guy used to wear about 7 layers and be out at sea for long stretches. He might well have been relaying information to some kind of handler, but without his personal testimony, the police wouldn't be able to submit what they'd learned as evidence, meaning he was the one we needed to disappear if we wanted our own imminent problems to do the same. Naturally, Dennis volunteered on the spot, saying he'd see to it personally if we raised his share. Hans agreed, but he also wanted one of us to be there, partly to make sure Dennis didn't go overboard and draw unnecessary attention to our dealings. It might sound crazy to some, but I put up my hand right away. Having been the one to deal with him for the most part, I took Niels's deception personally, and I also felt responsible, and felt if I paid more attention to him, I might have noticed his betrayal somehow before it became a threat to us. There was also a self-preservation aspect to it too. Hans was clearly feeling murderous, enough that I believe that he'd have killed me in that warehouse if he'd suspected me of being the mole. So what better way to prove my loyalty to the operation above all others than deal with Niels personally? We bought a gun after that first robbery 2 years prior. I knew how to shoot it, just not accurately, but I wouldn't need to be accurate when I put it to Niels' head. And if it jammed, well, that's what Dennis was there for. And so off we went, at a time that we knew Niels would be alone at the docks doing paperwork after his crew went home. We'd set it up as a meeting, so we knew that he'd be there, but he knew we were coming too, so there was a chance the police might take the opportunity to snatch us before we could go through with the hit. But that didn't deter me. I was quite literally furious beyond reason. I'd done everything I could to keep him happy and on board, and he repaid us by ratting us out to the cops. So when I walked through the door to his office, I had no problem pointing the gun at him and demanding to know when he started talking to the police. And that was all I personally wanted to know. When. I wanted to know which time he'd told me, "Okay, I'm good, everything's fine," and it was all a lie. Which time he shook my hand and then went right to the police to rat us out. There was still a sliver of doubt in me, a kind of hope that it was all a terrible mistake and there was no mole at all. But to my horror, Niels admitted it. I told him if he told me the truth, I'd let him leave. drive him to the airport, and put him on a flight to Brazil or something before his family followed. And he believed me and asked me what choice we had given him. The implication was that he was trapped, that his family was at risk, and it gave him no other option than to work with the police. And while Nils's eyes kept on darting towards Dennis, I mistook the look for fear, and what it truly was expectation. Once I decided Nils truly had to die, that he had betrayed us, I tried to pull the pistol back so I could shoot him. But no sooner did I grab the slide than I felt something cold and rigid against the back of my head. And then I heard the voice of Dennis in my ear saying, "Drop it." I tried to argue with him, but Dennis moved like lightning, sending the grip of the pistol in the back of my head, and he hit me so hard it felt like he cracked my head open, and then said he wouldn't tell me again. I thought the only explanation was that Dennis was working on behalf of our supplier, and that fearing our imminent arrest might put them on the radar of Interpol and had ordered us to be liquidated. It was like a triple crossing or something. Very confusing to be in the middle of, especially when Dennis wouldn't answer any of my questions. And things only went down after dragging me back to the car and he told me I was under arrest. Within minutes, the whole place was swarming with police cars, one to take me into custody and one to take Nils off to safety, and maybe half a dozen filled with officers who searched the entire site for anything incriminating. The same thing was happening at our homes too, with officers emptying closets, drawers, and cabinets for anything they could use to prove we were traffickers. And they found a lot. Enough to put us away for quite some time, and the only reason I got out after 8 years was because I was a model prisoner who paid a lot of money in restitution to the state. When I got out, I had to enroll in all kinds of post-release programs, and one of the conditions forbade me from reaching out to Wim, who was out himself by then, or Hans, who got a lot longer than Wim and I thanks to him being the ringleader. I ended up going back to university and starting my own business, and then a few years after that, I met my girlfriend, now wife. Meeting her was like a rebirth, and I felt like I'd been handed a second chance. I wasted my first one, and as I tell her every day, I won't waste the second. Not for all the money in the world. I spent 8 years undercover in the New Jersey Mafia, and as you can probably guess, it wasn't pretty. Now, it sure ain't the Sopranos there anymore. All the wisecracking, lovable rogues are either dead, in jail, or consulting on the next Scorsese movie. The smart ones got out too. Investments, stocks, all that Wall Street crap. And now they're just living off the interest and waiting to die so they can hand it off to their doctor, lawyer kids and Guido grandkids. And when they left, they took it all with them. All the shell companies, all the scams, all the connections with New York. It was all gone. Only a handful of families stayed together, and the ones that did found themselves competing with the Russians, the Albanians, and a 1%er motorcycle gang called the Pagans. It got real ugly up there for a while, and the DeCavalcante crime family was bringing in military-grade hardware from out of state just to take back what they considered theirs. And since I was already working undercover with a couple of DeCavalcante associates, I started working the weapons angle to try and figure out who their connection was. I was hanging out with this guy called Tony, because that's one thing that definitely changed after The Sopranos. Every third guy was named Tony, and it was a nightmare. Tony D, Tony S, or in this case, Tony V. But anyway, Tony's an asshole, a real piece of crap. But he was close to the weapons shipments, so he's who I attach myself to. We used to hang out at this bar which paid them protection money. I used to play like I was Tony's driver so he could get drunk. That way, he kept me around because I was useful to him. He could get sauced and I'd be his sober proxy doing pretty much whatever he asked me to. And since that meant that I was a shoo-in to get info on the weapons they were bringing in, I didn't mind being some a-hole mafioso's gopher. One night, he gets a call saying he needs to go make a cash delivery, which I assumed was connected to the weapons sales. Tony then finishes his drink and tells me to drive him to his girlfriend's place, which turned out to be this cramped one-bedroom in the Ironbound. Tony was married already, and he had a couple of kids too, but he also had this Colombian side piece that he used to visit sometimes. He used to tell her she was his girlfriend and made all kinds of promises to her about taking her on vacation to the Bahamas one day, but it was all nonsense. He was just using her to get off, and so he could turn her apartment into a goddamn stash house. Now anyways, we show up at the apartment building and somehow Tony's able to get us in without buzzing because the block's buzzer is busted. We walk up to, I think it was, the 3rd floor, and then Tony starts banging on our door like, "It's me, let me in." And there's this moment of silence before we heard her saying something like, "Hold on a second," but then we both heard it. There was fear in her voice. Something was going on behind that door. I knew it, and Tony knew it, so he started hammering his fist against the door, saying, "Open this door right now." Now there was another cry of, "Okay, okay," before we heard the chain and key locks being undone. And then Tony shoved his way into the apartment while asking what the F was going on. Now the first thing we both see is this girl's bra just lying there on the couch while she's wearing nothing but a towel. Tony then rushes into her bedroom and sees an open window leading to the fire escape. He then found a guy's shoe under her bed, and that's when all hell broke loose. He moved fast, grabbing her by the hair and yanking her into the room while yelling and still holding the shoe, saying, "What the F is this?" I said nothing at first, but then he started hitting her. Not slapping her either, like straight up punching her. He hit her in the stomach, and then once her hands weren't covering her face anymore, he started slamming his fist into her face so hard she was bleeding from the first blow. I stepped forward, my hand reaching for the piece I kept hidden under my jacket. I told him this wasn't the play, keeping my voice low and steady, trying to cool the situation down without sounding like a cop. But Tony whirled around towards me. His knife was already out, and then he lunged forward and pressed it to my throat. Not so hard that he'd cut me, but hard enough for me to freeze up and raise my hands in the air as in to surrender. And he warned me, in no uncertain terms, that this was his business, his woman, and if I knew what was good for me, I'd back the hell off. Now I knew the one wrong move in my cover would be the least of my problems, so I raised my hand slowly, eyes locked on his, and told him it was none of my business. Tony's girl was screaming and pleading, but I forced myself to stay in character. I was a loyal foot soldier, someone who sympathized with what Tony was doing, and so that's how I played it. But at the same time, I told myself that if he tried to kill her, I'd drop him. No hesitation. My Glock was ready under the jacket and my finger itching on the trigger. But he hadn't crossed that line. Not yet, anyway. Tony turned back to her, shoving his girl against the wall before he started ranting about how she'd betrayed him, how she was going to be sorry, and how he'd make sure that she never did it again. He called her all kinds of terrible things, and how he'd make sure that she was back in Bogota by the end of the week, because he had friends in high places. That last part was bullcrap, something he used to scare her, but even though they weren't directed at me, his words cut deep. I could see her flinching every time he raised his hand to her while tears were streaming down her face, and then he backhanded her so hard it actually echoed around the sparsely decorated apartment. I remember shifting my weight uncomfortably, ready to intervene as Tony grabbed her by the throat. He then slammed her down onto the worn carpet and then started beating her again after putting the knife on a nightstand. He humiliated her verbally the whole time, telling her how worthless she was, how she'd pay for disrespecting him. She curled into a ball, sobbing and trying to shield herself, but he wasn't done. He kicked at her legs, yanked her up again by the arm, and continued to assault with open palms and closed fists, all like I wasn't even there. All I could do was stand there, jaw clenched so tight it ached, with every instinct screaming at me to end it. Life undercover means buying your sense of right and wrong under layers of deception. I'd seen Tony rough up rivals before, but this was ugly in a way that made me sick to watch. I wanted to shoot him, but my mind kept going over the consequences, how killing him then would have blown months of work, as well as endangering the larger operation. Shooting him might even get me killed, but I told myself that if he started to strangle her, or if his hand found that knife again, then the rules had changed. I kept on watching, feeling my trigger finger burning, but finally Tony stepped back. He was sweating and breathing heavily while his girl was laying on the floor bruised and whimpering, with blood trickling from a split lip. He spat on her, told her what would happen if she ever crossed him again, and then, as if flipping a switch, he turned to the nightstand which had the knife on it and went back into business mode. He took out bundles of cash that she'd been holding for him and then tossed them at me to hold. Then we left her there, broken on the floor. I glanced back once as we stepped into the hallway, trying to memorize anything I could so I could write it down later. I felt disgusted with myself for not stopping it, but that's the job right there. Become the monster so you can catch the bigger ones. Outside, we climbed into the car and Tony lit a cigarette. I could see how his hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, but he started talking about the drop we were headed to like nothing had happened. I nodded along, playing my part, but in my head I was already drafting the encrypted notes that I'd send later. Details on the cash, the drugs, the violence, all of it. As we headed toward the warehouse district, I kept my eyes on the road as my mind replayed the beating. I hated myself, but this life doesn't let you save everyone. Sometimes you just watch, practice patience, and wait for the net to close. Undercover work was the hardest thing I ever did as a cop. It strips you down and makes you question how much of yourself you lose to the character you're playing. But Tony V trusted me more than ever after that, and saw me as someone who knew when to shut up and back his play. By the time we reached the drop point, my resolve had hardened. Tony V was going down one way or another, and when he did, I made sure that I buried him for good. I'd been deep undercover for nearly 18 months, worming my way into the East Midlands drug networks that fed the streets of Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby. My name was Gilly, a pale, unreliable smackhead who'd been brought up on the estates. The handlers back at the station had spent weeks getting my look right, including the movie makeup track marks that were convincing enough under scrutiny, and the clothes which smelled of stale sweat and damp. I was slow and I didn't talk much. Being a man of few words was your best bet around those sorts of people that I'd infiltrated. On the night in question, we ended up in a rundown flat on the edge of Northamptonshire, one of those pebbled dash 2 up 2 downs that smells like damp plaster and old cigs. The windows were boarded up on the ground floor and the only light came from a bare bulb swinging over the kitchen table. The top man, who everyone called the gaffer, had called what I thought was a routine meeting about the next shipment coming in from the coast. I was there because I'd earned a fragile place on the fringes of their operation, doing things like fetching wraps, taking the fall on small dumps, and proving that I was too much of a junkie to be anything other than harmless. At least, harmless to them, anyway. When the gaffer walked in, the atmosphere shifted completely. His face was tight, his jaw clenched like he was chewing glass, and then he told us why we were really there. Word had gotten out that someone was talking to the police, and this was all off the back of a big seizure the week before, which had cost them serious money. I knew they chalked it up to bad luck at first, but now the paranoia had set in hard. The gaffer didn't raise his voice, he never needed to. He simply told us that there was a grass in the room, and that he was going to find it. 3 of us were pulled forward, me and these other 2 low-level scroats who were paid in junk, not cash. I was positioned against the cracked kitchen room wall between a quiet lad from Derby who'd been moving gear for him for years, and another face I only knew from drops, a twitchy-looking toe rag with prison tattoos creeping up his neck. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I kept my face slack and my eyes half-lidded, with my shoulders slumped like the only thing on my mind was the next fix. And that was the trick to everything, stay in character even when every instinct screamed to run. The gaffer pulled a gun like it was nothing, this grubby, dark thing that looked like it changed hands a lot while seeing plenty of use. He checked the cylinder in front of us just to prove it was loaded, and then he stepped to the first man and I watched from the corner of my eye as he pressed the barrel against the lad's forehead. The room seemed to shrink for me as the adrenaline started to kick in, and the air seemed to get thicker as he laid out the situation clearly. He either told him the truth or one of us wasn't leaving on our feet. The first man stood rigid, breathing fast and shallow, but had nothing that satisfied the question hanging over us. They say time is an elastic concept, and it's true, because in those types of situations, entire minutes stretched out to feel like 5 or 10 at a time, like the rules of time and space don't apply to you anymore. And that's what I meant about the room shrinking too. So much in life is about perception, undercover work included. The gaffer lowered the gun after what felt like ages, though it was probably only minutes, and then moved along. The second man tried to keep still, but his hands twitched at his sides. When once again the barrel went to the lad's head, it was like I could smell the fear in the room. But since my own shirt was practically soaked through under the ratty hoodie, that might have just been me. I focused on breathing, keeping it slow, shallow, and disconnected. Any twitch of real panic, any sign that I wasn't as high as I was supposed to be, and I was finished. But then came the biggest test, because then it was my turn. The barrel was still warm from being pressed against the skin of the other lads, but I kept my gaze fixed on a stain on the opposite wall, letting my body sway slightly as though the withdrawal still had a hold of me. I acted strung out and dopey, but inside, my mind raced through every mistake I might have made, every slip in the cover that could have caused my luck to run out. I could feel the gaffer studying me, looking for the tell that would mark me as the informant. Then just as the tension reached a breaking point, the lad to my left broke. He started stammering about a rival dealer operating out of a lockup in Leicester, and how he'd only bought it from him once or twice. He swore he hadn't said anything to him, not on purpose anyway. I stayed exactly as I was, detached and distant, even as relief washed over me like a wave. The barrel lifted from the head and the gaffer stepped back, seemingly satisfied with the information he'd been given. He hadn't been looking for an informant, he'd just been looking for the dickhead who'd been speaking to the people they shouldn't, because even a breach of discipline as small as that needed nipping in the bud before it got worse. He pocketed the revolver, then told the three of us to F off, and then as far as I know, the meeting moved on to business as though nothing had happened. Later, I made the long, careful journey back to the safe house. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I debriefed the handlers over the encrypted line, describing every detail while the adrenaline still coursed through me, and how 18 months, a year and a half of work had nearly ended against the wall of Northamptonshire. But even with all I'd gone through, the operation had to continue. You learn to live with that gun to your head, and some nights I still feel that warm metal against my temple. I wonder how long it's going to be before it happens again, but the job continues. The criminals don't rest, not while there's lives to be ruining and money to be made while doing it. And so neither can we. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell down below to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are some super fun, goofy live streams that I do every Sunday and Wednesday night where I record the stories. So, if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. As you heard earlier, there's a new video out right now. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.